welcome to the New Books Network. I'm Pierre. Can cockroaches live in space? What would a brick have to say if you asked it? Well, a new book by Rolf Hughes and Rachel Armstrong, The Art of Experiment, Post-Pandemic Knowledge Practices for 21st Century Architecture and Design, asks and almost answers some of these questions. The book is in part a brief history of knowing, in part an experimental training manual, and in part a manifesto for knowledge practices in architecture and design. Rachel Armstrong is Professor of Experimental Architecture at Newcastle University. Rolf Hughes is Professor of Epistemology of Design-Driven Research at KU Leuven in Belgium. They both join me now to discuss their work. Welcome to the show.
Hello, thank you.
Thanks, Pierre. It's very nice to be here.
Well, I came across your work at one of those Zoom conferences that we've all been enjoying for the past year. And I remembered really startled by the kind of rapport and energy that the two of you had. I also have a slightly hallucinatory memory of one of you presenting from inside of a spaceship. So I wonder if you could start by talking a little bit about how you came to work together and what brought you to the subject matter of the book.
We first met, as I remember, when I was invited to the Bartletts to be an external critic for the ongoing PhD work there. And there was a procession of interesting projects. And then Rachel walked in and gave a talk which flew over my head, but I was inspired enough to realize that she'd changed the conversation entirely, that all our concepts were different from that point onwards. So I wanted to acknowledge that in my response, but also acknowledge that I lacked the tools to sufficiently engage with something I'd just witnessed. So from that point onwards, I was interested in Rachel's work and her way of thinking. And in fact, for many years in Sweden, where I was living, I would cite her work to all my students. It would be the sort of ending of a lecture where I could say, but here's somebody that's really reconfiguring the way that we think, the methods we use, and the concepts that we combine in ways that I haven't seen addressed anywhere else. So that was the beginning of a sort of connection that then took a giant step when in 2017 I got the possibility to join Rachel and the experimental architecture group that she was forming at Newcastle University for 3 years, and we started working directly together. We could say that before then we'd done our first collaboration was actually a book called Handbook of the Unknowable, a book that perhaps you want to introduce, Rachel.
Yes, and thank you for the resume. What Rolf has actually brought to a practice that I was developing, which was really trying to look through materiality from the perspective of an organism, to try and consider that the world itself had life, and if it did, then how did we design and engineer with that? So I had quite a technical and scientific understanding of materiality, and I was really chewing my way through this because I had to keep proving everything from scratch. My first question started out actually as a political position. I really didn't like the idea of genetic determinism, which imprisoned people's fate in their bodies. And so I felt that if we were going to be able to liberate the nature of life in a fundamental way, a new politics was needed for materiality. That meant it wasn't already assigned to a certain fate from its outset. And so I was looking to unconventional forms of matter, unconventional forms of life in order to unlock that potential. So I looked to the origins of life sciences. And so I was using 19th century experiments to revisit some of the fundamental questions that were being asked then about the nature of biology and its difference from chemistry. And so I was really starting from this first principles perspective. And so early on, when I came across the agent that I spent quite a long time with, the protocell or the dynamic droplet. Protocell's a controversial term. There are some that propose that it's actually the first artificial living cell. So that's Rasmussen and colleagues. There are others that say that it is entity that is lifelike but is not itself alive, almost like a proto-being. And that's the philosophical camp that I would stand in, that would be shared by people like Takashi Ikegami and Martin Hanzuk. But this entity became a tool for thinking and re-articulating materiality, the nature of life, and a politics of existence. And what I mean by that is the power redistribution between matter and context. So, the Darwinian body and environment axis, because if something is not technically alive and yet it has a relationship with its surroundings, there is a redistribution of where all the interesting activity happens. And the thing about these droplets was that you could actually see that happening. It was something that you no longer needed to theorize. Once you looked at the protocell, you started to actually engage with a different kind of materiality. It wasn't life, and therefore you couldn't narrate it in the biological tropes that have been used politically over the centuries. And nor was it non-living. It was definitely lively. It was recognizably lifelike. And so it existed in this intermediate zone, which was just a treasure trove of observation and reflection on those. And so I was taking this novel materiality, something I could actually experiment with for a walk in the world. And all the time I was being challenged by, what is the nature of this thing that you're showing us? What does it mean? Where is it going to end up? How did it come about? So all these kind of fundamental ontological questions, as well as the epistemological and the then applied questions about, so what do we do with this now? So I was really having to defend the nature of an enlivened materiality that moved away from this subject-object, human-centric worldview, and was actually presenting itself as an autonomous entity to audiences that found it as strange as I did. And so when I started having conversations with Rolf, I remember his reaction quite clearly when I presented this work at the Bartlett, because he stood up. And I thought that was most unusual. I was really trying to avoid having any debate about the nature of this entity because I knew it would be controversial. So I registered that. And so then when we started talking later, I was just really delighted that he had a wealth of, let's say, tools and knowledge that I had not had access to when I was trying to articulate the nature of this intermediate, ambiguous entity. And so those are the tools of the arts. And he had a fantastic repertoire of not just literary references, but he's a prose poet. And so he provided a way of talking about the entity that went beyond the scientific descriptions and justifications in which I was entrenched. I couldn't escape them because I was always being asked to justify them on those terms. So that Rolf's insights and then practice created these many new dimensions, which has actually really resulted in the book that we've produced together, the one that we're talking about today.
Rolf.
I identified that Rachel's work sort of occupies a space of contradiction and paradox, that she works with these concepts that are neither nor, neither living nor non-living. And that, it seemed to me, and also by combining different disciplinary sets like chemistry and biology, so you get artificial soil and, and it seemed to me that, first of all, there's a sort of interesting knot of thinking there, but also the way that that's embedded in forms of experience through prototypes, setting up experiments through prototypes in order to create these interesting epistemic things or conceptual models that allow you to think beyond yourself, So it's no longer a conversation about mere virtuosity. It's kind of, I don't think either of us are particularly interested in that. It's more a question of how to put together the appropriate and most expressive conceptual tools that allow you to go to a place that you wouldn't otherwise arrive at. So the book I mentioned, which was the first time we collaborated, the Handbook of the Unknowable, this got me very excited because basically Rachel set this question, how might we travel beyond the solar system and see the conditions for life on a journey that might take 20,000 years or more? And you could very quickly realize with that sort of question and related ones, like how do you navigate when there's no sense of forward or backwards or north, south, west, east, because conditions are in constant flux, your relationship to time has changed, that all your existing tools are quite useless, because they're designed for life on Earth. And so you have to really start from the premise of unknowing rather than knowing, and start to sort of think what might be, best equipped to tackle those sort of questions. So the book itself follows a journey from, if you like, the humanities into poetry and madness and black pages. As we journey further away from certainty, the book mirrors that in its structure, that the early contributions are essays, and later it becomes a combination of poetic contributions, of images, and even a gibberish from the SETI satellite, which is traveling through space, screaming neurotically into space to try to get an answering echo from some format there.
Well, I want us definitely to get into some of the experiments. The book we're discussing is itself called The Art of Experiment, and one of the joys in it is that you go through applications of this bewildering type of epistemology. But I think it would be good to start at the beginning, and you do start right at the beginning. The first chapters contain an account of the Big Bang. So I wonder whether you could give us a kind of potted, brief history of knowing as you think it, maybe for your purposes, diverts from mainstream narratives.
Yeah, thank you. That's a really interesting question, because the question that bothers me when I am observing these dynamic bodies with agency is this primal question that, there is life and non-life, and the various degrees of agency that are expressed, throughout the universe, from nebula and the birth of stars, to the wriggly nature of soils, to the ways that rocks weather, or a volcano erupts. They are not classically alive, and yet they have this agency. And the thing that starts to bother me is that if this matter does not have a notion of agency, it doesn't have the capacity to make decisions, then how do we have that capacity? And so the starting point for thinking through the knowledge that matter possessed and the contradictions that go into the material world as we know it through 21st century insights, astronomical, quantum physics, a whole bunch of new knowledge that has been produced over the last century. How can we incorporate that into our relationship with knowledge so that the very stuff that we are made from is being expressed through the kinds of conversations that we have about knowledge? So the first thing for me was to find the space in matter through which we can have agency. And so then that meant a kind of rethinking of the nature of matter and the very start of our stories of the world, and not creating that binary rupture between intelligence and matter, which comes with stories of God or these ideas of super intelligent beings that never really materialize. Can we actually place that agency within matter itself. And so, the book opens with the idea that, when we actually look, through our 21st century lenses at the nature of matter, it is a paradox. An atom isn't a hard thing. It's a cloud of probability that's, even within itself made of an ecology of actants that we don't fully understand. And therefore, it is impossible to say that, oh no, intelligence doesn't reside there. And of course, that kind of pronouncement also makes us question, well, what is this intelligence that we're claiming authorship to? This thing that we say we value. If we cannot recognize the co-constitutive agents and the tiny conversations and negotiations that are going into the very matter that makes up the world, what else are we blind to? So really, it's a very primal stage for setting the possibility of an enlivened world, not as a matter of belief, but as a affirmation of acquired knowledge, and the start of a story where knowledges are not absolute but are enfolded into each other, that each knowledge form informs another and enriches it, and really trying to set a stage to pay attention and be aware and receptive to the possibility of an expanded sense of agency from the very beginnings of matter itself.
What your summary makes clear, I think, Rachel, is that ethics is implicated in this discussion from the very beginning, so that instead of knowledge as some sort of instrumental tool that one can extract and disseminate and share and apply, rather we are sort of resetting the question in terms of issues like care and attention, being aware of proximity, being able to coexist or to draw forth that which is outside language and that which doesn't have a voice. And so there's a very strong, despite the title and the focus on knowledge, there's actually a very strong emphasis on a sort of ethical resetting of the knowledge discussion.
Until you do that in a book in a very striking way. I mean, a reading of the Big Bang and evolutionary cycles through that kind of lens that already implies ethical considerations, and it read almost like a story, like a novel, which is really beautiful for an academic book, and rare. So I think it would be really interesting to punctuate the conversation of the theoretical claims of the book with some of the examples that come from your practice, which are the experiments themselves that you already alluded to. I have to ask you about the cockroaches. This is the experiment with which you open that section. I can't unsee it. I can't unremember it. What is it? What does it have to do with architecture? What do cockroaches know?
You should see the video, Pierre.
I'm happy to share it. We can link it in the show notes. If it's something we can share with our audience, I'm sure they'll be delighted.
Well, the cockroaches were a way of prototyping the possibility of existence beyond the planet from a non-human perspective. So this already exists with the International Space Station, and we can think of that as the first space house, if we like. So from the third millennium, around 6 people have lived, in shifts constantly away from the planet's surface. And there they have conducted a whole range of experiments, from, how do we wash our teeth, to looking at materials and other ways of looking at the world, using the microgravity as a way of understanding things that we have assumed to be constants on Earth, and observing what happens when those constants are taken away and that our experience is relocated in another space. And I was very interested in this idea of life beyond the planet's surface, and I was trying to figure out which experiments had been done in the International Space Station that showed us, what kinds of animals could thrive in these extreme conditions. And having gone through quite a number of experiments that were documented by NASA in public records, I noted that cockroaches were not on the list. They had mice, they had flies, they had spiders, they had cats, dogs, but cockroaches were remarkably absent. So that got me thinking, why is the data on cockroaches so absent? So in this experiment, I obviously took the idea that cockroaches have a reputation for being super hardy. Um, they were also the subject of a conversation I had had many years earlier with Jake and Dinos Chapman, who were reflecting on what kind of non-human soap, let's call it a kind of domestic drama, could they set up, which touched a nerve with the public, but not in a horrible way. And the conversation went along the lines of if we had a drama with mice, they're furry and they have bright little eyes and whiskers and they're kind of cute. But cockroaches, people don't really care about cockroaches. Maybe those could be our workhorses for this particular soap. I don't know if they ever went through with their cockroach drama, but that conversation stuck with me. So when I was thinking about how might we run an experiment where cockroaches, as a kind of drama, in an extreme condition, shared their knowledge with us, their embodied knowledge about what it meant to inhabit an extreme environment. All these factors came together. And so we made a very simple biosphere, which is really out of a flask that you would normally contain liquids in, prepared it for a journey into the stratosphere. I was hitching a lift on existing commercial payloads that were organized by Nebula Sciences. And the first payload I could get away with in terms of looking at extremophiles and how these agentized forms could exist beyond the world. I started actually out with the protocells. I thought that the simplest forms of agency might be the most hardy, but they weren't. The protocells got made into soup. They started off as lovely little looking bodies, and by the time they got jiggled around in the crosswinds in the atmosphere, they turned into brown mud. So that payload was a bit of a write-off. And so the second one, I thought, well, let's take hardier integrity. We'll try cacti, because there were also aerophytes, which are plants that actually don't need soil. They dangle their roots in the atmosphere and they pick up moisture that way. So I thought if I made an aerial garden from cacti and aerophytes, then maybe we could actually follow the journey of these beings and have a look at their hardiness in space, but in a way that was framed as if it was curated and designed by not necessarily by humans, but a garden, a kind of community of bodies. What was interesting about the cacti was that they started to become loose, and the hardiness of their structure actually started to shred themselves. So they started to cut each other, and they shredded each other. And then the platform itself, the balloon burst in the commercial payload, and the whole garden fell to earth. And it's this spinning, nose diving, ex-garden of unearthly delights, perhaps. It was really very Bosch. So yes, there's this kind of dramatic nosedive of these ugly objects that actually look really quite beautiful once they're framed against the backdrop of our beautiful planet.
Which brings us to the cockroaches, and the way that they were framed could not be by any stretch described as beautiful. They were in a sort of plastic jar and silhouetted against the sky as they disappeared further and further up. But it's quite a striking video, quite a harrowing video in many ways.
It is, and I mean the environment for the cockroaches. I just want to say, like the ethical consideration. I mean, there was no intention for macabre voyeurism. The idea was that we would watch a choreography of cockroaches as a form of embodied knowledge, so that as far as we could in the wild, in the stratosphere, we could learn from the hardiest creatures on Earth. If protocells couldn't make it and cactuses couldn't make it, what could the cockroaches tell us about life in extreme environments? So they were given a little bit of food. They were GPS tagged, and they had a warmed plate. So they had like a little spaceship, a little cockroach spaceship to go up in, a little bit of food, and a camera that was in a fixed position at the bottom of the flask. Well, of course, as the balloon rises, the first thing that the cockroaches do is disappear from view. They go up. So for about 20 minutes, you see nothing but the cockroaches hiding right at the top of the flask. You don't see that, there's just nothing. And then after a while, a cockroach drops down, and we realize that actually the heating plate has failed. And the cockroaches actually, you can tell by their movement, are starting to feel the cold. And so the blood in a cockroach doesn't flow through its body like our tissues in a closed vasculature. They have a very open vascular. They have like a straw-like fluid that goes through their body. And so as the ice crystals formed, their movement changed. And so they slow down, they become visible in front of the camera. And so first one does this kind of, instead of this quick movement that you would associate with trying to catch a cockroach, it's a very slow, labored movement. And of course, they're not eating their food. So one falls down and then the other falls down. And so we can see them right in front of the camera. And this rather harrowing exchange between two cockroaches and their bodily movements and their relationship with each other is really this stumbling between something that looks like they're fighting or they're trying to have the last cockroach baby before the species comes extinct. And it's really hard to actually understand, which movements belong to what set of intentions. I think the most shocking part of that video, though, is that the extreme environment itself acts on the cockroach capsule, and effectively the glue on the capsule freezes and the capsule is fractured from its footing on the payload, and the capsule tagged with GPS falls to Earth. Now, there is a moral in the story because the cockroaches were tracked through their GPS locator and they were fine. So the moral is, if you want to get rid of your cockroaches, do not put them in a flask and send them up to the stratosphere, as they will be back.
Wow. Okay. Apart from the fact that this is incredibly amusing as a story, you've touched on so many things that, to me, as a former scientist, has to pick up on. And you do that in a book beautifully, is that you've run all these questions of how science has been done. But, questions like, why is it that cockroaches have not been sent onto the ISS? You've kind of covered so many of these grounds, whether by design or even inadvertently. Even the fact that your capsule fails produces produces an outcome. So I wonder if we could use this moment to go to the way that you outlined the history of the way that knowledge has been constructed and your own new framing of organa paradoxa and how that might play itself out in your investigations.
Yeah, so the idea of knowledge instruments is a very old concept. So Aristotle's organon was the kind of ontological framework for knowledge of it up until the Enlightenment and even beyond that. Um, a way of organizing the world through an instrument of knowledge making created a certain kind of thinking and practice that defined the classical world. So that was called the organon. And Francis Bacon in the Enlightenment um, decides that there needs to be a more rational instrument, which he calls the novum organum. And so this is the new instrument for looking at nature. So Aristotle's knowledge was nature based, and so was Francis Bacon. But his knowledge was grounded in what we might call the modern scientific method. So with formal kinds of laboratory experiments, with a certain kind of rationalism, what we might now recognize as reductionism, and a simplification, a kind of a clarification of relationships between cause and effect. And so the way that, let's say, the world has changed in the last year with the advent of the pandemic. Let's call it as an expression of the factors that have been rampant in the Anthropocene with climate change and human incursions into every part of the planet, from our microplastics to our exploration of space. That what we were looking for was a new knowledge instrument for these weird and wonderful times, that the old organum, the novum organum, were not helping us address. And what was interesting about the term for the organa paradoxa was that we were looking for the exceptions and we were looking for multiples, so that the two previous forms of knowledge, or the knowledge instruments, were anthropocentric. And we were asking ourselves, if we expanded to the realm of cockroaches, what it meant to know how to live, then what would the knowledge instruments that we would need, and what would those knowledge instruments look like? And so that was the ontology of the organa paradoxa. And the paradoxa is really looking at the exceptions on the tree of Linnaeus, as he, the accountant of God, starts to take stock of God's household and starts to order all the different life forms. And then he comes across a whole bunch that I think disappear after the first two editions of his binomial classification. So things like the unicorn, and the kraken was the giant sea squid was considered to be a mythological beast. So and then it wasn't. So there were these grey areas in his form of classification, where he had to re-rationalize nature. And so he threw out all these things that didn't fit. And it was those things that didn't fit in the empirical order that he then imposed on nature that became interesting for us as a site for thinking about where might we find the new knowledge instruments that could tell us about the things that the Enlightenment and then modernity had controlled.
And part of that quest to look for forms of practice which may be knowledge generating but had been discredited by the modern period was to rethink what had been privileged in research and in science from the Enlightenment onwards, and to look at what was, as it were, going on simultaneously, but became discredited by scientific practices. So, we take a swift overview of the Enlightenment vision with the idea of reason through Bacon, Descartes, and Locke, and on the one side, leading to individualism, liberalism, freedom, and then capitalism and wealth, and on the other side, leading to science, and from there, engineering, development of material goods, medicine, and health. All these things harnessed in the pursuit of happiness and the notion of progress. So the idea that you are, incrementally building and developing knowledge and technology and materials and medicine and so on. So everyone's happy and everyone's getting healthier and so on, which is all very well. But, beneath that, there are a whole series of knowledge generating practices which have been driven underground, and things like witchcraft, augury, alchemy, which we felt must have been contributing to, for example, material knowledge transfer. Whether or not it succeeded in turning lead into gold, no matter. At least the experiments were developing a fantastic amount of knowledge. Likewise, in you could say varieties of so-called witchcraft would be also producing certain performative insights and so on. So we wanted to sort of revisit some of those and see what we could bring into. And again, some of our experiments, I think, are drawing on those types of practices and creating sort of complex, spooky, unresolved environments in which unpredictable outcomes could occur. I think the very first example of that was our first performative collaboration, which was the Temptations of the Non-Linear Ladder, a piece that was exhibited as part of the Do Disturb Festival in Paris in 2016, I think. And we brought together there a number of, or two circus artists and a director from Circus Circur in Sweden, and their technical director. We created a black pool and a rotating steel platform and had a series of Madaka fish on columns around this pool. It was set in the Palais de Tokyo in Paris. It was set in a very atmospheric corner of the building called the Temple. So it already had this sort of quasi-religious vibe to the space. And we brought these strange elements together, and without any rehearsal, without any script, without using any language in the presentation, and we invited these incredibly talented circus artists, who one was a contortionist and the other one was a world champion in street dance, so they really knew how to use their bodies to move through. We gave them the brief of transitioning between different planes of existence to move through this apparatus that we'd set up there. What we discovered was that, well, first of all, we wanted to put a focus on the reflections, rather than the virtuosity of the movements themselves, but the actual, the black mirror, what was occurring through the ripples and the water and the reflections that would set up. And also, we discovered that were not only creating a sort of story machine using this apparatus, that every iteration of this experiment would produce a different type of story, but also they was almost conjuring forth in an occult way an aspect of the architectural space that wasn't visible to the eye. That there became a column of performative space that suddenly became very present through a combination of dripping bodily movements, rotating steel platforms going up and down, and this sort of the waves on this black mirror, and the light from the videos of the protocells that also surrounded the space as well.
Yeah, and I think the audience of other bodies, which were the Protocell, so we had the Protocell films, almost like watching this petri dish of transformation. And the Madaka fish were significant in the fact that they are the only vertebrates that have successfully had progeny in space. And so it was an evolutionary stage in some ways, and that the black mirror and the circus bodies were a membrane that was mutating and dissolving into itself. Um, And I think what was really interesting about the choreography, the extreme nature of the bodies. I mean, in some ways, they lost, even though there was a man and a woman. They were no longer really gendered. These were entities that, a bit like the cockroaches in some ways, were really engaged in acts of survival and transformation all at the same time. And it was a potent cauldron of events, reflections. The outside was coming in. It wasn't a carefully controlled space, it was very leaky. And it was incredibly moving to watch because you actually had an audience that kept coming back for the 9 iterations of this performance. It was really spellbinding because there was something at stake that even at the most basic level, you could feel before you could see. And so there was this whole kind of energy that was happening in the temple.
And at the same time, Rachel and I were photographing it continually, so we became, in effect, part of the performance, if that's the right word. So this sort of separation of the observer from the phenomena and this documentation process was actually built into the thing itself. But it was fascinating because it was enigmatic. It wasn't an illustration of an idea. It was a bringing together of a series of elements and skilled practitioners. And I think what it taught us was that this is actually a very rich working method, that if you work with people who are extremely good at what they do, you come together in a spirit of experimentation and curiosity. You set up a frame and then you let the program unfold the way it wants to unfold. And everyone is bringing their skill, but they're not working in terms of control and mastery or virtuosity. They're contributing their skill towards the others and towards the unfolding improvisation and reaction and counter-reaction and so on.
So I think this is a good moment to dive a little bit formally into the divisions and the connections between disciplines. I mean, I know, Rolf, that you have been engaged in the intricacies of artistic research as it's been establishing itself as a discipline, and you just alluded to a research practice that sites itself within a contemporary art institution. Rachel, you are formerly an architect. So I think it would be good to look, as you do in the book, at some of the ways in which this exchange can be rendered productive.
Yeah, well, I think that's such an interesting question. And I just want to say that actually I'm a medical doctor. I actually trained and practiced as a medic, and I am an architectural designer rather than an architect. I don't have a formal architectural qualification. I have an architectural PhD, but one that wouldn't qualify me for making a building.
Well, you've built home for cockroaches
I
that's
built a
let
home
them
for
survive the
cockroaches.
apocalypse. So I think we're safe for now.
So for me, there was already a journey, which was the relationship between the body, technology, and space. And I was already looking for ways of expanding my knowledge and understanding. And I needed to be receptive to other forms of influence if I was going to be able to address the questions I was asking. And so before I got to the protocells, I was actually a medical student in a sabbatical in Pune in India, where I was on a leprosy colony. And I was assisting a hand surgeon doing surgery on people with leprosy. And what's interesting about the leprous body is that it cannot feel pain because the bacillum, which is a bit like TB, but it eats into your nerves and kills them. Um, it means that you can't feel a surgical knife. But if you have an anesthetic body for too long, it means that you don't protect it because you have no way of stopping yourself from coming to harm. You've got no sense of your hand against a hard surface, for example, or your feet against the ground. And so all these kind of secondary problems happen from a primary source of infection, which is the bacillus. And so with the hand surgeon, what we were doing was restoring movement to broken parts of the body where the person was still maybe able to move their fingers but couldn't move their thumb and therefore couldn't work. And so what we could do was to take a finger tendon and transplant it into the thumb so that people had to learn how to use their thumb by formally moving what was previously their finger. So they had to readjust their own anatomy and their own relationship with their anatomy in order to maintain a certain quality of existence, which they wanted. So, what was interesting about this was then that it wasn't just really a question of the body, it was a question of the body in the world as to how this body learns and is rehabilitated and then is restored as a social agent, becomes a family member, and becomes a productive participant in the community. I had lots of questions about that. So I needed a really expanded palette for that. So I needed to, first of all, be receptive to a need and recognize that the discipline in which I had been trained couldn't answer all those questions. And so the space that seemed to be able to take those next steps actually was the arts and architecture, the arts for notions to do with the body in space, and architecture for the choreography of the materials and the affordances around a rehabilitated bodily agent.
I think what Rachel and I have in common is this notion of being slightly nomadic in a disciplinary sense. So it always amused me when I would try to present Rachel's work at the end of a lecture that you had to first of all try to, categorize what her field was, and that was an impossible task. So in my own case, I studied literature as my first degree, and then went to UEA to do the master's in creative writing, and stayed on to do the first PhD in creative and critical writing, as it was called, which meant I wrote a novel for my PhD and then an essay about the novel. So that in itself led me into an interdisciplinary group looking at skill and knowledge transfer and practical knowledge, which had its roots in Sweden, hence the invitation to Sweden. Because in that group I worked with two things really, the play as a form and the philosophical dialogue. And we started exploring the philosophical dialogue as a way of bringing together opposing or unresolvable positions, and how that could be used pedagogically and also in interdisciplinary conferences to allow people a common reference at the beginning of a meeting of people interested in questions of skill and rule following. So the point about the philosophical dialogue and the play form was really to look at different, at that time for me, literary forms that would be more appropriate for holding different perspectives within the same frame. So that then, in my relation to literature, led me to the prose poem, which I think of increasing sort of density or plurality of voices. The philosophical dialogue or the dialogue allows two positions and a third space, the hermeneutic space of the reader. But the prose poem is more like a monster form because it takes promiscuously from whichever literary language game it would wish. So that for me was a very attractive form, and because of this skill and technology link, I landed in the architecture school at KTH, Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and started talking to architects about their research and their transfer of spatial thinking into linear textual forms, and started seeing with some confidence, because I'd got away with my own PhD writing a novel for it, how we could push the boundaries of the PhD to allow more flexible and expanded performances in language within the PhD form. So that led me into not only, if you like, monstrous literary forms, but also the idea of monstering disciplinarity itself. I sometimes say that, I kept putting myself in situations where I didn't know what people were talking about in order to find out, how they look, what conceptual tools they use, and to add them to my toolkit. And that then also led me to developing the field of artistic research in Scandinavia for 20 odd years. And what was interesting there, artistic research is the idea of, if you like, research through practice. And it's based on the assumption that there are forms of insight that are achievable only through the specifics of a given practice that would not be arrived at through any other means. So it's sort of recognition that the research field has been, if you like, engineered a certain way, but there's been an acknowledgement that those people who have been outside that conversation are also producing valuable methods and insights and concepts and contributions to research. What I realized when I started as part of that working for the Swedish Research Council is that many of the questions that supposedly were unique to artistic research were increasingly starting to affect other research areas, including the sciences, such as the problem of classification, the problem of evaluation, the problem of disciplinarity itself, you could say, as people start working in more hybrid or interdisciplinary forms. And so the exceptional started becoming an enabler of conversations in other sections of the Research Council elsewhere.
And I think this is really interesting, because where I connected with the whole artistic research trajectory that you've just described, Rolf, is in embodiment. So having been a medical doctor standing outside a body, scalpel in hand, doing things to bodies. The ability to stand inside and be a body in a world was a language that artistic research actually offered. It didn't exist in the sciences, because you have to detach yourself as an external observer in order to be a body. And so the language and the insights and the tools and the kind of whole portfolio of approaches that you brought enabled, certainly from kind of my science technology approach, to suddenly stand inside the world that it had made for itself, and start to inhabit it in a different way. And for me, that was, I think, looking back on it, that is what the protocell was for me. It was a body, looking out at the world, and I was looking back in, and the bodying between these two very different agents, yet still had this conversation that I had absolutely no ability to describe other than through the narrow lens of science. That's not to say that that the protocell wasn't born through scientific knowledge, but it was a perspective to knowledge making that was absent from the tool set that I was used to using.
And that's where the dialogue continues to be a very useful tool here, because it's not only in our work, the way I think of it, it's not only an exchange of views between embodied human or philosophical positions, but it's now can be a dialogue, or rather perhaps the impossibility of dialogue between something outside language or a non-human element and an observer. So that gaze you just described with the protocells, I think, is also affecting the way that we approach things like microbes, and bricks, creating.
Setting up our next segment perfectly, because you very kindly sent me a recording of Living Brick, a dialogue by Caustic Ophelia. So it would be fantastic if you could introduce this before we listen to a bit of the work.
Caustic Ophelia is a material experiment that again builds on this idea of agentized matter, and the complexity of the materials that we take for granted, specifically those that form our soils. They have this rather Cinderella status, and yet they are so essential for life. And when I was working with protocells, I could see how material layers appeared to be in conversation with each other. And so the idea was to create a complex experiment that created different chemical layers between organic matter, to have a range of different programs that may have to do with color, to do with chemical reactivity, and the ability to change with time. And so we created this beautiful body that was a combination of living things that there were petals actually, that we went around Newcastle's courtyard collecting them on the ground, and then took precious materials, so gold leaf and copper, and really created a body of layers of gel and chemicals, like we were building a creature. And it was in almost a container that was see-through, like a glass coffin. But the interesting thing about this coffin or this box was that you could see the section of the body as it was being formed. So in some ways there was a kind of Frankensteinian purpose if you were going to use a protocol of care and insights from chemistry and biology to create tensions between materials in a way that the structure could be alive, this soft structure in a hard, clear shell, so that voyeuristically we can actually see what happens to that process. And at the same time, we understand that this isn't a Frankensteinian success. This is actually quite the opposite. It is made so that it can transform again to become soil. And one has to ask whether this is something that is dying or whether this is something that can actually be reactivated by the rehydration process and the adding of water again. So the idea was to make this ambiguous body, a body with the intention of something that possessed some of the qualities of life. It wasn't trying to be an organism or a person, but it certainly had qualities about it that were incredibly appealing. So we placed the body in this box for the whole world to see.
Well, we should also say that it was exhibited at the Adaptive Architecture exhibition at Nottingham Trent University in 2018. It came out of a brick dialogue series. We were really interrogating the brick for reasons which we will explain later. But the brick as the fundamental unit of design, and saying, what might a brick be? How might we reconceive the brick? Because if you could have a living brick, you can have a living home. If you have a living home, you can have a living neighborhood. And what does that do to our concepts of inhabitation, neighborliness, kinship, and so on? And so this was part of that series of experiments to rethink the brick. I would say on the literary side, I was sort of interested in this idea of constant slippage. That you're constantly slipping in your frames of the reference. It's no longer a stable narrator or voice coming from one single position, but rather the perspective is shifting all the time between slipping through chemicals, slipping from human to non-human. And yet at the same time retaining some narrative tension and some logic of exchange. So there is a voice that is moving continually in the piece, I think, but it's also being affected by this process of decay and deterioration and then regeneration as well. It's at stake in the process that Rachel just itemized: chemical dehydration and rehydration. We started working through Shakespeare's heroines for these series. The next one, in fact, was called Cracked Hermione, picking up on Hermione in The Winter's Tale, who, as a result of her husband's jealousy, died of a broken heart and was, by some magic of stagecraft, turned into a statue, until many years later, when Leontes had repented of his foolish jealousy, that her maid was able to touch her, and again, by the miracle of stagecraft, the statue steps down and is a living, breathing actress again on stage.
Well, no such luck for Ophelia, unfortunately.
No.
So let's listen to an extract from this work now.
Let us acknowledge it.
Acknowledge it.
A spore of pollen inside a balloon.
Inside a balloon.
Glass of fashion.
Of fashion.
Mould of
form.
A drum inside a bloody room.
A bloody room.
The whole world.
The whole world becoming stone.
Did you think it might rise?
Did you think it might rise?
I wanted to sink.
I wanted to sink.
Here's rue for you.
There's
none for me.
For you. There's none for me.
The eyes of poor Ophelia.
The eyes of poor
Blasted.
Ophelia.
Ecstatic.
Blasted. Ecstatic.
Whatever worm eats or impregnates.
Whatever worm eats or impregnates.
Under that
I sucked that honey.
His breezy
under
vows.
That bed.
Sweet bells.
His
jangling,
breezy vows. Sweet
my
bells jangling. Caressing my river's silvery skin. Disordering the petals you plucked.
Petals I plucked from the wind.
These petals I plucked from the wind. Mulching.
Always something turning to rot.
Or
the blue bacteria.
Let us acknowledge the blue
blasted
bacteria.
Mulch.
A spore of pollen.
She's drying out.
Inside the balloon.
Dying to dry out.
She's drying out.
Caustic
mould. Dying to dry out.
Eat me.
It's caustic wit.
Seeking.
A drum.
An open coffin.
Its heat
a
bloody room. An open
heartbreak.
The whole world within
Caustic
many rivers.
Copper.
Mulching.
Ophelia!
Heartbreak Hotel.
What?
Caustic
Nothing.
soda. She's drying out.
Nothing will come of nothing.
She's drying out.
Ophelia!
Good night, ladies.
What?
Good night, sweet ladies.
Nothing.
Good night. This artificial heart. What
Nothing
of it?
will come of nothing.
It's not nothing.
Good night, ladies.
Good night.
Good night, sweet
Good night.
ladies. Good night. This artificial heart. What of it? It's not nothing. Good night. Good night.
Well, fantastic. This was Caustic Ophelia, which I believe I can just about see in the background of Rachel's Zoom window. But before we got into the usefulness of dialogue, which I think was amply illustrated with this extract, Rachel, you mentioned Frankenstein. Rolf, you've referred to monsters a fair few times. And this is an apparatus that you do also develop in the book, which I think is part of this toolkit for experimentation. So I think it would be great to round up our conversation to understand how you see these kind of bodies as being productive and how people can join in this experimentation.
I think for me, the organa paradoxa is there to re-enliven, re-enchant, re-empower those agents, those bodies, those presences that have been factored out of the value landscape of modernity and the Enlightenment. And ontologically, we were looking for those kinds of agents that didn't already fit, and but also we were looking at processes within life itself that are inherently creative, that seek to defy these neat categories that Carl Linnaeus set, that there are specific species with binomial nomenclature, and that the organa paradoxa gives the world permission, in a sense. It's already got this permission, but it recognizes its vibrancy and effusiveness in these almost profane forms of mixing and relating. It's as if matter wants to be with other matter, and it doesn't have the kind of discriminatory apparatus that, let's say, biblical stories about Noah and the ark might have, or Carl Linnaeus's notions of binomial nomenclature, or eugenics, with its notions of perfection and hierarchy of species. So it kind of moves away from a hierarchy of order of being and starts to look horizontally towards expanding itself through not just kin, so making kin, as it were, forming family, not just forming family through other kinds of body, but also through kith, a re-relating of the fundamental nature of environment, being at home in a place. And so the organa paradoxa, in some ways, takes the constraints of life to allow it to overflow these categories. And in that very overflowing of category, that sense of monstering starts to declare itself. And we took that imperative and started to work that into some of our prototypes and experiments.
It's a response to a world in a state of constant flux, and has been underlined by the fact that the COVID-19 pandemic struck us during the final stage of the book. But in other words, a response to the need for radical change at a time of ecocide, and an attempt to really think about what forms of cooperation and acts of generosity that underpin healthy ecological systems might be coordinated or choreographed, as Rachel said. It's bringing together different voices and materials and media and practices to try to synthesize the potentiality of monstering. And I think our sort of aim is to, through this term monstering, is to generate qualitatively new encounters in the choreography of space and its inhabitation, to challenge normative protocols and existing practices by embodying the unknown and the uncontrollable aspects of the world. So we see it as a way of embracing our innate zoophilia, which is from Rosie Braidotti, and to increase our ability to respond to ever-changing realities, finding new forms of diplomacy.
And I would say also it is a fundamentally ethical practice, not in the sense that it is always good, but because it is problematic, to, let's say, take the gloves off life and allow its promiscuity is a very dangerous thing to do. So this idea of the precarity of this kind of radical creativity, in the production of prototypes, these provisional bodies, is a way of celebrating diversity, difference, and paradox, and enabling previously subdued agencies to become increasingly lively and present, but not to run away from the difficulty of that, but to actively engage in as Rolf has just said, the diplomacy of negotiating our relationship with an enlivened realm.
Well, this is a beautifully challenging and hopeful place to end our conversation. I'll include links for our listeners to some of the projects and some of the videos we mentioned, which I thoroughly recommend. I mean, cockroaches and space bouquets are definitely an experience. We're going to play out the episode with an extract from a recent improvised work by Rolf that was made with colonies of instruments and audio effect and explored interactions between microbial cultures. So do please stick around for that. And for now, Rachel, Rolf, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure, yeah.
The Art of Experiment, Post-Pandemic Knowledge Practices for 21st Century Architecture and Design is published by Routledge. I'm Pierre and the editor is Marshall Poe. Thank you for listening and join us next time.